Gràcies a tots per haver vingut a la Fundació Antoni Tàpies aquest vespre en el que celebrem la figura de Harun Farocki. Aquesta exposició de la que hem tingut cura plegats Antje, Eman i jo mateix vol ser un tribut a l'obra d'un treballador compulsiu com ho era Harun Farocki, fascinat per la representació del treball i que aquí es troba àmpliament representada en totes les peces que tenim distribuïdes entre les tres plantes. Per això, més a prop? Ok, Quim, sort d'ell. Per això, invitar a Hito Steyerl era de sentit comú. Qui millor que ella per omplir de sentit aquest tribut. Hito Steyerl no sols ha estat algú molt pròxim a Harun Farocki, sinó que amb el seu propi treball ens fa veure l'extraordinària continuïtat de la seva obra. Aquesta conferència l'hem fet possible gràcies a una col·laboració entre el Goethe Institut de Barcelona, l'UP Barcelona i la pròpia Fundació Antoni Tàpies. Vull esmentar especialment a Emilio Álvarez i a tot l'equip de l'UP, a Úrsula Val i Judith Mayburn del Goethe i a l'equip de la Fundació Antoni Tàpies, que sempre treballa per fer d'aquestes activitats moments productius i memorables. Gràcies a tots els que heu treballat perquè avui tinguem a Hito Steyerl entre nosaltres. I ara em disculpareu que llegeixi una breu introducció al treball de Hito Steyerl, perquè crec que una autora com ella es mereix una benvinguda generosa. Parlaré en castellà per allò de compensar les llengües. La obra de Hito Steyerl está estrechamente asociada a la tradición del cine documental, que ella misma desmonta de manera radical. Su propia idea del documental ha flexibilizado el género hasta límites insólitos. Desde que obtuviera un reconocimiento unánime con November en el 2004, un vídeo de corta duración en el que narraba de la desaparición de una amiga de la adolescencia que más tarde se uniría a la resistencia kurda, su versión de lo que es el documental ha evolucionado significativamente. Ha pasado de una estética de contacto empírico con la realidad, que entra en crisis al chocar con nubes de metadatos, a una estructura virtuosa en la que el artista es el centro de todas las especulaciones. Si en los títulos que siguieron a November la ausencia de Andrea Wolf se convirtió en una condición insoslayable que aportaba la tensión esencial al argumento, sus últimas producciones despliegan exploraciones complejas que nos presentan un mundo mediado por imágenes, píxeles y protones de naturaleza elusiva. Toda forma de vida fluye a través de la fibra óptica, hasta tal punto que la realidad que nos ofrecen piezas más recientes como How Not to Be Seen, A Fucking Didactic MOV File, Liquidity o Factory of the Sun resulta intangible. Los temas asociados a estos títulos ponen en entredicho la transparencia y objetividad que prometía la estética documental. A diferencia de lo que suele ocurrir con los documentales de factura clásica, con este tipo de vídeos, los vídeos de Hito Steyerl, ni siquiera es posible articular una sinopsis que condense los acontecimientos. El museo que analistas como Tony Bennett consideran un laboratorio cívico, para Hito Steyerl es lo más parecido a un escenario bélico. Sus atípicos documentales y conferencias parodian la impresión de libertad que se prodiga en esos lugares, en esos museos. A la postre, signo de una productividad social. Esa producción de carácter inmaterial exige cada vez más fluidez en la circulación de la información y la comunicación como garantía de una mayor productividad, aceleración y crecimiento. A través de la dilatada producción ensayística de Hito Steyerl, se diría que el capitalismo contemporáneo llega primero con museos que eventualmente se convertirán en en fábricas, donde las palabras, los signos, las imágenes y los gestos constituyen tecnologías que preceden a la máquina de guerra. Los vigilantes de salas del Art Institute de Chicago, protagonistas de Guards, parecen entrenados para intervenir en un conflicto armado, con la salvedad de que sus escaramuzas se despliegan ante un decorado formado por una colección de obras de arte moderno. El término engagement que describe las maniobras para reducir a un sospechoso, en esa pieza sugiere una perversa identificación entre las acciones del cuerpo de seguridad y las propias tecnologías institucionales que aspiran a movilizar la participación de públicos y, como no, sponsors. Estos agentes encargados de la vigilancia son los mismos que no dudan en referirse al visitante como una amenaza. De modo que los museos, en esas piezas, tal como dice uno de ellos, están en condiciones de ser considerados soft targets, objetivos susceptibles de ser atacados. La función de estos guardias consiste en protegerlos de un posible estallido de violencia que dañaría la propiedad, en las frases de uno de esos guardias que aparecen en la obra de Hito, o de lo que un lenguaje más propio del neoliberalismo denomina formas de actuar imprevisibles. De ahí que, a juicio de Hito Steyerl, los asaltos y ocupaciones de museos constituyan el verdadero acto de su fundación en tanto que instituciones públicas. Si las revoluciones clásicas desencadenaron repetidas irrupciones en el Louvre y en el Hermitage, en los últimos años las ocupaciones de centros de arte a un lado y otro de las fronteras de Irak han transformado estos lugares en campos de refugiados. Centenares de sirios han recibido atención humanitaria en esos centros dedicados al arte de especular con la cultura. Como dice Hito Steyerl en una conferencia originalmente presentada en el encuentro anual de CIMAM, celebrado en Doha en 2014, el museo ya no representa a una nación, sino que acoge a la gente que escapa tras su disolución. Los centros de almacenaje de obras de arte situados en las zonas francas de ciudades como Ginebra, Singapur, Hamburgo, Mónaco o Pekín son la respuesta insólita a un mundo del arte en el que los objetos están sometidos a un tránsito permanente. El duty free, tal como la artista lo denomina en esta conferencia pronunciada en Doha, filmada y subida a internet, se esconde en museos secretos cuya opacidad desafía la accesibilidad y transparencia de los museos públicos. La lógica de la globalización, viene a decirnos Hito Steyerl, produce agujeros negros. Ese mundo formado por bases de datos opacas y movimientos de difícil seguimiento inaugura la nueva realidad con la que el documental tendrá que vérselas. La naturaleza de esta realidad no es otra que la del arte contemporáneo, un sistema que el artista no duda en definir a través de las muy discutibles condiciones de posibilidad que ofrecen el capital, la propiedad inmobiliaria ligada a las grandes construcciones de equipamientos culturales, las ferias de arte, bienales, apoyados todos a su vez en una riqueza desigual y la guerra asimétrica. La última recopilación de ensayos de Hito Steyerl da buena cuenta de esta erosión entre los géneros y medios que antes mantenían identidades distintas. Los condenados de la pantalla, tal como se titula esta recopilación en castellano, un título que a su vez remite al más famoso de los libros publicados por el médico psiquiatra Frantz Fanon, teórico y crítico del colonialismo, se dirige a un lector que ha dejado atrás la oposición entre productores y consumidores. El perfil del lector de Hito Steyerl es un sujeto que aspira a una liberación en el mundo digital, un individuo agotado y exhausto, convertido en esclavo en virtud de un régimen de conectividad permanente, atado a dispositivos tecnológicos y al que todo lo que se le ofrece es la promesa de consumirse a sí mismo. Tal como la autora afirma, tal como dice Hito Steyerl, este individuo se da por satisfecho con imágenes de baja resolución y se considera, citándola ella misma, el desecho de todas las clases. Es lo que Achille Mbembe, tras actualizar el legado de Fanon, llama el negro. Objeto de las políticas extraccionistas, el negro es una materia energética susceptible de ser explotada como un recurso natural sin que se le reconozcan o retornen los beneficios. Ni siquiera el documental moderno, que tenía la virtud de transformar al espectador en ciudadano, puede evitar que éste se sienta un sujeto sometido al cual el entramado de dominación le queda totalmente oculto. En este sentido, la tradición a la que responde Hito Steyerl es la del documental posmoderno. El sujeto de esta genealogía, de esta otra genealogía, ya no se presume libre. Al contrario, se considera poseído, como los protagonistas de Le Maître Fou, que Jean Rouch filmó mientras sufrían espasmos y sacudidas. Si aquellas crisis violentas no eran más que un trance o ritual para ayudarles a acomodarse a un régimen de colonización psicopolítica, los vídeos de Hito Steyerl nos ayudan a adaptarnos al mundo de hoy, marcado por el totalitarismo digital. Una voz en off lo advierte durante los primeros minutos de Factory of the Sun y dice: no vas a ser capaz de jugar a este juego, él jugará contigo. Un síntoma de que la crisis de la forma documental representada por el trabajo de Hito Steyerl ha coincidido con un periodo en el que la moralización del capitalismo financiero ha hecho todo lo posible por anular los esfuerzos críticos. Así pues, y ya termino, nos sorprende que el título de esta conferencia, de la conferencia que va a pronunciar esta noche, sea Why Games? Can an art professional think? Hito, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours. Una bienvenida, Hito.
Generous and wonderful introduction, and thanks also to both you and Antje for having me here tonight. I not only very much appreciate, but I'm very moved, actually, being here tonight, seeing the wonderful show. When I entered the space, it occurred to me that, you know, being amongst the works of Harun is probably the closest thing I could feel to being at home in the world. So thank you very much for that. This lecture is completely inspired by some of Harun's work, but it doesn't talk about them. It takes them as a point of departure for asking questions about video games, who were, you know, an inspiration for some of Harun's last works. And I think, you know, I have to apologize. This is going to be partly complicated, mainly because I have difficulties understanding what I'm talking about. But I really want you to understand, you know, my incomprehension very viscerally, because I think at the end of the day, there's just one point I want to make, and I will make it on many different levels. You should not dismiss games or video games at all, because on the, you know, most people think they are unreal or just, you know, pure fictions or distortions of reality. The contrary of all of that is true. Games are reality. Games are new technologies of government, of, you know, trying to compute and manage populations. And this is what I'm trying to figure out in this whole talk, which will get at points a bit technical. I apologize for that. But, you know, I think I was motivated to write this lecture by a profound disappointment with the dismissal many peoples in the cultural sector express towards especially video games, right? I mean, they think they don't have to deal with it because, you know, they are a totally minor and abject form of, you know, distraction, basically. And just to give you one example, one of the things I really can't understand is when people want to say something really bad about war, you know. They don't say war is brutal, war kills people, war is war. They say, you know what's so bad about war? It's just like a video game. I tell you, I cannot really understand this. You know, the worst thing to say about a war is that it is a video game, because obviously, you know, people are trained in game-like strategies. They are divorced, you know, or they are separated from the consequences of their action by a screen. I completely understand all of that kind of critique of alienation that's going on in there. But you know, tell me the truth, do you think it's much better if someone shoots you in the face and there is no screen, you know, to separate you from your target? Is this a more honest form of killing? I mean, just remember Hiroshima, there was no screen in between, you know, the people who dropped the bomb and the people it was dropped on. Is this any better? On the contrary, I have to tell you that actually if war was just a video game, everyone would be so much happier, to be honest, you know, because in video... Whoa, okay, this is very, very glitchy. It will go from the poor image to the poor talk. Let's try again. So I was trying to say, you know, if war was just a video game, everyone would be so much happier, because in a video game you shoot somebody, but then, or you get shot, but then you respawn again, nothing happens, in fact. You know, you can even throw nuclear bombs on whoever you want. No one dies, no one even notices. I tell you, if wars could be transformed by some kind of miracle into video games, everyone would be just so much happier for it. But on the contrary, you know, there seem also to be people historically who sort of think that games or forms of play are just a form of emancipation from the tyranny of management and labor. Just to give you one example, which is a manifesto that's really inspiring for me, written by Dutch artist Constant Nieuwenhuis in 1974, and he advocated play as a form of the human emancipation from the tyranny of labor. And of course, this kind of optimism is something that I think we have to call into question as well. Reading this kind of quote, this is, you know, from the New York Times, a quote from an article where a person that works in a Chinese game sweatshop talks about his condition of labor. He says, for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, my colleagues and I are killing monsters, says this person. And what he does is actually he's mining golds and other assets within games, World of Warcraft for example, which he then sells to Western gamers. So that's mainly the kind of labor that's being done under really underpaid labor in sweatshop conditions, which makes one think, of course, are games in the present condition really a kind of emancipation from labor? Maybe not. Maybe there is something on the contrary, which is a sort of really intense game labor. And this game labor seems to turn humans somehow into robots, into people who mechanically repeat some gestures and actions. And from here on, I want to, you know, go into a very well-known traditional formulation of this question: what is the difference between a human and a robot? And you all will know my example. It's an example by Alan Turing, who came up with this test or distinction. It is basically an experiment to distinguish human from robots in 1950. He asked the questions, can machines think? And he put up a very interesting scenario, which he immediately labeled as a game. This is a game. You distinguish a human from a robot by way of a game, and this game is called the imitation game. So basically, there's one person that's the interrogator, and there's behind the screen 2 other entities. And by posing questions to these entities, you have to find out, are they humans or are they machines that are pretending to be humans? And if the interrogator doesn't really know by the answer, then Turing suggests to assume that this machine who manages to confuse the interrogator is a thinking machine. This machine can think. Just to give you some example about the questions, and this is very, very interesting, mainly in terms of gender, because the thing that the machine has to achieve is to basically confuse the interrogator about whether he or she is male or female, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in relation to a machine, but this is kind of the distinction. If anything, a human or a machine manages to confuse a human about his or her gender, then if it's a machine, it can think. This is really interesting. So you see, it's already a very complex setup, and it's much more interesting and complex than just, to have some kind of quantified response about how fast a machine will solve a complex kind of mathematical exercise. And interestingly, within 10 years, within a decade, there are two of these games, imitation games actually, that are used as main metaphors to think through very vital questions of their time. In Turing, it's the imitation game, but of course, you can also see Walter Benjamin's famous allegory of the chess Turk as a sort of imitation game. The chess Turk is, of course, actually a human that tries to pretend it's a robot, right? You remember this example. It is a machine that is invincible in chess playing, but it turns out it's not really a machine. There is a human in there, and this human tries to pretend it's a robot. And I will come back to this later. But historically, it's very interesting to see that, Turing's example of the imitation game is set in a time where something called game theory starts to emerge. So what is game theory? Specialists among you will, of course, know what it is. This is a very, very, let's say, symptomatic proposition from the book that basically established game theory of games and economic behavior, written in 1954 by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern. And the idea is basically to formalize a sort of economic transaction as something that has rules and whose possibilities can be entirely computed, calculated, and predicted. So, if, for example, the general, I will just try to move until I find a spot. Maybe I should try to pull this over here. Maybe it will work. Okay. So the general idea of game theory is that you formalize, human behavior, mostly economic or military, into this kind of game. And the hope is, of course, to calculate all the possible outcomes and give probabilities to each of them. And of course, the problem is very obvious, because in order to be able to calculate it, you need to have all these things that are assumed to be given. For example, that all the people that participate in economic or military transaction are rational, to simplify. Or that they always want to maximize utility and profit, and that they have full and relevant information. So to put it very shortly, human behavior is abstracted to a degree to become, let's say, not entirely realistic. But it didn't specifically diminish the success of game theory, which became a quite important, branch of science, because, of course, it was augmented and amplified by World War II, that, especially after World War II, where, of course, the possible outcomes of military conflict, there was a huge need to calculate them very efficiently. Okay, but so the game theory depended on this kind of, let's say, rather unrealistic expectations of human behavior, but there were also other interesting conditions with game theory, which was that basically the game that is being set usually is a very confusing set of rules which are thrown at you, the public, with astonishing speed, and you're asked to calculate all the possible outcomes very quickly. I want to give you one example. This is the famous Ellsberg paradox, which I will just use as one example to show you how confusing these games are. So this is basically an urn, and there is a lot of balls in there, red balls, black balls, yellow balls, and you have the possibility of making bets, you know, on the amount of balls in there, but you can't see them. You have to guess. So, and then you get a set of 4 different options. You receive $100 if you draw a red ball. You receive $100 if you draw a black ball. You receive $100 if you draw a red and yellow ball. You receive $100 if you draw a black or yellow ball. And people were expected to give serious answers to this kind of questions. But I tell you what, I know that it's quite, you know, complicated to do it very quickly, so I did it for you. I calculated all the probabilities, and I will give you the best and most rational strategy, which is the strategy number E, which is to respond to this person. You know what, I don't need any balls whatsoever. Just give me $100, you know, it's fine. But I have to tell you, you know, even though all of this is really confusing, it started generating and producing realities very, very quickly. Because, you know, for example, John von Neumann, mathematician who came up with the basically game theory, he realized very quickly that, you know, human beings weren't really rational enough to comply to game theory. It didn't really work. They just couldn't do it. But if human beings were not rational enough, then the solution would not be to pretend they could be rational, but to invent something that would be rational enough. And actually this is how the computer really started to come into being. Of course, you know, there were previous attempts of developing computational machines. Babbage, Lovelace started doing this already quite a while ago. Alan Turing started working on this, but the big breakthrough of the first computer actually was made by John von Neumann in the attempt of solving this problem. If humans aren't rational enough to, you know, work through questions of game theory, we have to create a non-human actor, and this is the computer. And this is already the first point I'm trying to tell you when we go back to the beginning of the lecture. Computers aren't, you know, devices that distort reality by, you know, spamming people's brains with video games. No? On the contrary, if it wasn't for games and game theory, there would be no computer whatsoever. It's the game that created the computer, right? A certain idea of games created or facilitated, accelerated the development of computers. And the game, or this kind of idea around games, was a sort of very, very strong, I call it a generative fiction, you know, that started producing reality. And there was a lot of reality being produced, you know, as a consequence of that. Of course, the development of the computer, actually one of the first things that was run on this new computer were calculations for simulations of hydrogen bombs, right? I mean, not only the whole consequences of computation are sorts of real life effects of games, but of course, apart from this, also, you know, neoliberal policies, tons of military applications, nuclear, non-nuclear targeting devices were developed on the base of this theory, deterrent strategies, management theories, planning systems, and so on and so on. So you can see that a lot of the contemporary reality as it exists was basically spawned and created as a result of this kinds of theory. And this is basically one of the reasons why we live in game space, as people have argued, not because there are so many video games around, but because games, and preferably video games that deal with war and the economy, they are kind of like ideal models, of what came to be realized in the world. They present like the Platonic ideals, right, of how people thought that humans should act and think. And this is, of course, also why most currently existing video games are exactly located at the intersection of, economic transactions and military action. So you shoot someone, you get 500 points. I mean, there's also more complex versions of this. But apart from this, games also, of course, and this is an idea that Harun has explored in many of his works, even before he started, dealing specifically with video games. They work as a sort of behavioral training for people, not only to train them, into for military action. Do you remember? There's this British prince, Prince Harry. He said, he was fighting as a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan, and he says he has a game thumb. This is why he was able to do it. But of course, games also prepare people behaviorally for functioning efficiently in the workplace, and so on and so on. So Harun has talked a lot about his work about these kinds of things even before he explicitly went into addressing video games. So yes, as I said, video games now have dispersed, or the structures, the mechanisms of games have dispersed into all aspects of life as so-called useful games, or you could even call them operational games, if you want. And I want you to think back of the Turing test, because probably you are taking a Turing test almost every day without really noticing. So how often in the past years have you been subjected to this kind of exercise? So this is, of course, a capture, a completely automated Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. So basically your computer wants to check whether you are a human or a robot. So you have to undergo the Turing test all the time, but not to prove that you're a thinking machine, but to prove that you're a human. But you have to prove it to a machine, right? Not to a human. And also, it's the most dumbed down and awful version of this wonderfully complex and inspiring game that Turing devised, because you have to do the most stupid things to actually prove you're a human. You do the things that a robot could probably do much better than you to prove you're a human. So basically you have to read and copy a word, into some field. You do this to prove that you're a human. But in fact, you're not only proving that you're human, and this is much more interesting, because actually when you're doing this, you are working. And you are working on correcting Google Book scans. Google has this, large-scale enterprise of scanning basically every book that exists, and machines do it, but the machines make mistakes. So basically the humans, while trying to prove they are humans, are correcting the errors of the machines. They become the assistants of the machines. They become basically the robots for the robots in trying to do that. And there is a person who said, there were about 500,000 hours per day that people were taking this kind of exercise, and this is like wasted labor power. Why don't we just, make people work while they are trying to prove they are humans? And this exercise was upgraded. You probably know this kind of captcha. And you have to basically confirm they are house numbers or type down the number. This is actually an exercise to involve you in improving Google Street View, because Google Street View captures basically by having all these Street View cars, most of this, or a lot of the 3D reality physical space, but then of course sometimes the machine cannot read the house number, or it doesn't know that it's a house number, and so on. And by proving you're a human, you're basically improving Google Street View, making everything trackable, searchable, locatable, and so on, and so on. And this is most interesting because this is more old school already. Since I think last year you have this kind of thing, right? And this, I mean, it looks much better. Actually, I'm so happy about it because the other things I cannot really read, and then, oh, it's a mess, and I never manage to prove I'm a human, and I cannot access my bank account or whatever. So now I just click, I'm not a robot, and it's fine. But why is it fine? That's really interesting, because Google will not tell you exactly how they know you're a human, but they tell you they have a sort of secret way of finding out you're a human. So this is basically a combination of how your finger moves on the trackpad. You do kind of movements which the machine would not do, apparently. That's also rumors. None of this is really disclosed. And then, of course, the computer accesses your browsing history, you know, to figure out whether you have a sort of bot browsing pattern or a human browsing pattern. So basically, by scanning you, Google has an idea whether you, as a human, corresponds to the idea that Google already has of you as a human, because Google already knows who you are, right? And if you do not correspond to their idea of who you are, you cannot access your bank account. I'm really sorry. You know, this reminds me of this old story by Oscar Wilde. You know, what is this? The image of Dorian Gray. Do you remember this? There is a painting and the person does not age, but the painting ages instead. So in a way, Google has your real painting. It's in their attic, right? But if you do not look like this painting, then you cannot access the house anymore. So this is the interesting form of test, you know, and you are doing this by trying to prove that you are a human. You are not a robot. So all of these are kind of updated Turing tests that are happening right now. And the story goes even further because, in a way, there's an additional aspect to this, which has to do with the, you know, larger context of computation, which is basically about trying to extract patterns from large sets of data. If you want to, you can read it. I will try to really summarize it because it's very technical. Basically, it means that people have decided that in order to know who you are, metadata analyzers don't really have to look at you and what you do, but they look at people who are similar to you. They could basically look at your Facebook friends and extract a sort of average from them, and then they would know what you, in brackets, look like. So this is an interesting idea of trying to, you know, make the distinction between human and robots by saying not you are a human because you behave like a human, but you are a human because you look like other humans. It's a sort of truth by correlation or truth by similarity, which is kind of really interesting because, you know, mathematically you had to prove something. You had to, you know, make the case. But now you just have to make a case that looks like the case in order to make your point or to make sure that you as a human will be identified if you basically look like your Facebook friends. And this will become very, very important later. I want to think back to Turing's game, and what's the difference between Turing's original game and this kind of, capture game? Because in Turing, the game was interesting because a machine would be seen as intelligent if it managed to confuse, an interrogator about its gender. But in this kind of game, it's not about confusing people, it's about identifying people. And this is very apparent in recent Facebook identification categories. Facebook is not trying to confuse anyone about gender. On the contrary, it has established 50 boxes, of different genders that you can exactly check to state your precisely defined type of gender in order to receive targeted advertisement. So this is absolutely the contrary, right? It's not an imitation game, it's an identification game. And the interesting thing to think back to Turing's test is that, identifying someone by similarity or by correlation, identifying you by knowing your Facebook friends, for example, is something that was also discussed by Turing in his initial paper, but again, he had a much more complex case. He said that, again, to answer the questions, what is the difference between a machine and a human? He said that, probably machines cannot behave like humans because humans have this very complicated and frankly, well, he didn't say so, I say so, well, frankly, very weird kind of behavior. For example, a machine could not act like a human being, and this is a quote, a white man that bonds with another white man over strawberries and cream. Because this is what white men do. They have strawberries and cream with other white men. So in that sense, probably a machine cannot do this. But does this mean that this machine is not intelligent? Probably not, right? And the interesting thing is that this idea of the white man having, strawberries and cream with other white people has now moved into the heart of what they call network analysis, which is this kind of extended identification game. It's called homophily. What does it mean? Homophily is the assumption that people like similar people, and they will do things with similar people. So, white man will have strawberries and cream with other white people. So how could this, be an analysis of anything? It's very simple, because if Facebook sees that you're having strawberries and cream with someone, and you are a white man, then probably this someone will be assumed to be another white man. This is how this kind of correlation pattern works, and this is how they don't even have to know who you specifically are, because they analyze basically who your network is and just assume, well, you probably look kind of similar. So again, there is this real difference between this kind of identification game and Turing's much more sophisticated game, which is, if anyone will press you very hard about who you really are, then a really intelligent machine, in Turing's view, would just start to, talk about the weather, probably. I think this is how Turing would define an intelligent machine. If it doesn't want to answer the question, it will start talking about the weather. So now you will remember the beginning where I said game, it would be great, if war was just a game, and then the world would be so much better. So how does this relate to this kind of game? Social game, real game that are trying to define whether you are humans and what kind of humans and who you are having strawberry with all the time. Surely I don't mean this kind of game, right? No, I really don't, because I think a game would be a desirable game from my point of view if it was possible to just wipe the score and start anew, and have anew as many identities as you like and not be bound to this kind of history. But this is really not how it works. And interestingly, artists know exactly that this is not the case, because, for example, artists are being ranked by so-called scores, which are calculated in a very similar way to game scores all the time. Artists' production and work and labor and performance is being quantified by algorithms to rank it in the form of very concrete scores, right? You know, I mean, artifacts work like this, they have this kind of score, they have the assumption if you have many shows, then the value of your artwork will rise, which I cannot exactly, which I'm not really sure whether it works, but you know, artifacts is kind of really, let's say, conservative in comparison to newer algorithms which are ranking artistic output, such as, for example, ArtRank, which you probably all have heard of. It's a kind of, well, I don't even really know how to, it's a, let's say, investment consultancy in which emerging artists to invest into. And they have, of course, an algorithm which ranks artists' performance. It is, of course, secret, but the consultants of ArtRank still feel confident enough to classify people into certain categories which are by now under 10,000 until 30,000, 100,000. Early blue chips sell now, and until recently they had a category which was called liquidate. You had to get rid of these guys immediately. And there was a kind of, people were thinking this might be a little bit too brutal, so they renamed it. But anyhow, so, and the interesting thing is no one really knows how this algorithm works, and actually the rumor was that there is no algorithm, actually. There was just a bot which was attached to the Instagram of some famous collectors, and it would just see what the collectors post and then basically calculate it and come up with this kind of advice. Yes. So you see how you, I don't know how many of you are working in this field, but whether you play the game or not, you are being played. You are getting assigned scores, whether you like it or not. And this is just a tiny example of a large number of so-called social scores, which are starting to be implemented right now. And some of them are very old, and you know them already. They are like traditional credit scores, you know, which your bank will assign to you based on whether you pay your bills, whether you default on your rate payment, and so on. So a credit rating score is this kind of score, definitely. These are known, but the interesting thing is that these kind of credit scores are being expanded big time to include not only your financial behavior, but basically all forms of behavior, including your shopping, your behavior on social networks, your driving record, your health record, and whatever else data, whatever other data trails you leave. This is the so-called Sesame score. The Sesame score is a better version of something that is going to be called the social sincerity score, supposed to be implemented until 2020 in China. And this will basically combine databases that run from your financial behavior over the stuff you post on social media about and including the shopping you do, and also ranking the things you buy in relation to their social value. And plus, this will also include the things that your friends buy and their credit scores. So if you have rich friends, it's good for you, but if your friends default on their rate payments, then your credit score will go down as well. And of course, this will be linked to your criminal record and other, databases for every citizen until 2020 to get one single number which expresses the score of what is called your social sincerity. And this is very interesting because it's not implemented yet, I have to say, and probably no one really knows what it will look like, but someone has given an indication saying someone who plays video games for 10 hours a day would be considered an idle person, so your score goes down. But someone who frequently buys diapers would be considered as probably a parent who on balance is more likely to have a sense of responsibility, so your score goes up. So basically all the products you're shopping for factor in this kind of score, and this is like a totalitarian game, a game in which basically every kind of activity is being not only quantified and calculated, maximized for efficiency, but also goes into this kind of score. This is a quite expanded form of gaming, I have to say. So, now, you have realized already from the difficulty I have to try to explain these things to you, that I'm totally not an expert in all of this, and I'm not trying to pretend I am, but I'm really thinking now, okay, I'm working more or less in the art field. So, what is the specific expertise that people in this field can bring to this problem? Is there anything like that? I mean, usually, as I told you, most people that are working in the field don't really care, or they think, games are just this sort of, distorted version of reality. But I think, on the contrary, that actually if people in the art world working with culture really want to, they have a really, really vantage point in dealing with this kind of problem. Why is this? So I found this is a column by Paul Krugman. Don't worry, I will read out the relevant parts to you. And in this column, he tries to explain why did the financial crisis happen? Why did it happen? There were so many algorithms. Game theory was used big time. Everybody had already figured out all the probabilities of buying and selling black and yellow and whatnot balls. It was all mathematically sound. The financial system, how did it come down? What went wrong? And Krugman just wrote it down in one single sentence, and it became really clear to me. He said, the economic profession went astray because economists mistook beauty clad in impressive-looking mathematics for truth. So basically it was not about whether the mathematics were had a relation to reality, whether they were measuring any sort of, hard facts or data. No, they looked so nice. This is why everyone believed in them. They were sublime, they were so elegant. It was really a problem of aesthetics. The financial crisis, according to Paul Krugman, happened because people were seduced by beauty. And this is, I think, a point of entry where people in the art world, in fact, can start to engage with this. Because, Paul Krugman assumes that beauty can be a major problem for humans, and I completely agree with that. But, in the face of beauty, people in the art world know exactly what to do. It's a very tried and tested strategy. They found a wonderful way of preventing beauty to be confused with reality. The solution is actually to lock up anything that's too beautiful in a museum. In the museum, these things can be beautiful all they want. They can, do proclaim best possible worlds, worst possible worlds, ecstatic experiences, ideal models of human beings, and so on. And if you leave the museum, these things will just stay behind. They will not bother you. And as if you switch off a video game, actually. So if, for example, you had a museum where you basically put all these algorithms which are too beautiful to be true, then you could, still enjoy the beauty of them. You could enjoy, the exhilaration of having strawberries and cream with as many white men as you want. You could, enjoy nuking Hiroshima with your sheer thumb if you really want to. This is because it is in a separate realm, which is not reality, which I call the museum. And people traditionally have found a word for this. They call this realm the autonomy of art. And this kind of autonomy assumes that there is no connection between art and reality, and I think in this case, this is really a good thing. You could put, all these equations into a museum, and anything that's just too beautiful to be true, you say it's art, and you lock it away. So, this, of course, applies to, all these models I told you about previously, models that basically derive from the irrational assumptions of game theory and so on and so on. But now, as I told you, mathematics and science has progressed. And truth is no longer calculated from models, but derived from correlation, pattern, and similarity. As I told you, people are trying to judge you by the associations you make, not by what you actually do. And the interesting thing is, this sounds a bit difficult when it's about mathematics, but just think about art, and it becomes absolutely clear, So something that is judged by association or correlation. This is how people have been explaining the art world, at least since Pierre Bourdieu spoke of habitus and distinction, right? I mean, this is how the art world works. It works by who knows whom and who is associated with whom. If you look at this from the point of view of art, there is really not the feeling of, this new scientific epiphany which we have to submit to. It is actually the way most people understand the art world anyway. Because white men bond with white men over abstract expressionism. That's correlationism in the art world. It's worked like this forever. And the same applies to patterns. Patterns in science are now the kind of thing that emerges if you calculate, tons of data for days and days on end, and then you have this, mystical pattern emerging at the end, and this is absolutely sublime. But I tell you, this is something that we have a fantastic term to deal with in recent art, and this term was coined by art critic Jerry Saltz, who is an art critic for Vulture magazine, and he termed this type of pattern crabstraction. What did he mean? You see, there's lots of patterns. This is exactly how contemporary mathematics works. So these are abstract paintings, but how are they made? They are abstract paintings of random patterns from random data worth craploads of money because of speculative investment. Crabstraction is literally a capture for the idea that art is what your friends buy, right? The best of all possible worlds is realized by the fact that every hedge fund investor's living room looks exactly like that, with this kind of paintings on their walls. So crabstraction condenses the key ontological formula of our times. Art is what your friends buy. This is what this pattern says. This is what crabstraction actually says. This is a random pattern produced by, speculative investment and the computation that is associated to it. Beauty is what your friends buy. Truth is what your friends buy. You yourself are exactly, or at least you look like what your friends buy. So I was imagining, what happens if you use this as a sort of barcode and you scan it on your mobile phone? What happens? Of course, you will not see the algorithm for crabstraction because it is secret. But what will happen is a coupon will be sent out to all of your Facebook friends automatically. And trying to invite you to have strawberries with cream in a brand new game sweatshop in China. And if you don't do it, then you will have to buy yellow or black balls for $100 each, or check the box saying I'm not a robot, you know, for as long as it takes a Commodore C64 to calculate anything. So now you understand why I think that crabstraction is really such an important term nowadays, because just imagine, how does the NSA distill patterns from randomly collected data? Crabstraction. How are academic ranking scores calculated? Crabstraction. How does Google know whether you're a robot or not? How does contemporary biology, economics, computational science, social network analysis, art investment consultancy, how do all of this come up with patterns and risk analysis and reputation scores? Is this maybe crabstraction? So now, I told you, my idea is just to lock it up in a museum and close the door and walk away. But, you know, I think there's, apart, you know, from me making fun about it, there would be such a benefit to use museums to actually construct these models, more or less in real time, social models. All of these are basically social abstractions, right? They are like basically game theory that's formalized into a pattern. But how, if we use museums basically to create this kind of social abstract games to test different realities, for example? You remember there was this wave of so-called relational art, maybe a decade or more ago, where people, you know, had all these kind of social situations in museums to, you know, improve their relationships. And how, if this, and I think the real problem is that it was not seen as a game, it was seen as a reality. How, if one did basically the same and played situations which in reality are solved via game theory, like for example discussion of the Greek debt crisis. How, if this was really gamed in a museum as a sort of social abstraction to see, you know, what one can do with this situation, how one can intervene into it, and how one can change it. So this is not just, you know, a sort of sarcastical suggestion I'm making. I really think that one should appropriate games, one should appropriate this kind of settings and make them operational to test social relations and social change also in museums. Because, I mean, just imagine Victory of the Sun, the stage designed for Victory of the Sun by Lisitsky. That's a kind of social abstraction, right? Where social relations are basically tested in form of opera in this case, but they are, you know, set into relation with one another in an actual space. And in this vein, I think that one should basically try to come up with contemporary social abstractions and live game them in museums. Of course, you know, trying to limit the risk of these things going completely wrong, which exists, by first testing them in a museums and declaring them autonomous artworks. And of course, all of these, you know, experiments could turn out to be total crabstraction. This is definitely possible. Of course, you know, now you will probably try to tell me that my idea doesn't work because you cannot basically quarantine art in a museum. There is no real boundary between what happens inside a museum and reality. It will always leak, you know. And I will completely agree with that. I have said this several times myself. But on the other hand, I really insist that one should still try it. And why do I insist? And now I want to end it by going back again to Turing's test and have this situation once over again, the imitation game. And the question this time is not, can a machine think, or are you a human or a robot, but the question is, can a person in the art world think? And I suggested to solve it in the way of Turing, by having this imitation game. Let's say there is an interrogator, it's me. And I try to figure out whether my plan of declaring a sort of autonomous realm to play games makes sense or not. And one can simplify this question, is there an autonomy of the arts or not? And how do you answer then? You are player X. How do you answer? You know that, games, as I tried to tell you, are very powerful generative fictions. They tend to realize, right, their own rules in real life. Maybe not the way it was planned. Maybe something else happens altogether. So if you know that, do you then tell me, who is the interrogator, that unfortunately there is no autonomy of the arts and, abstraction will keep winning no matter what? Will you tell me that any kind of alternative model is just a fallacy because, however you model it, you cannot really translate it straight into reality? Will you tell me that at the end of the day, Google is always winning the game, as well as ArtRank and social sincerity scores and the NSA? Will you correctly check all the 50 boxes on Facebook and go shop with your lookalike friends? Or you could also decide differently. And in this case, I want you to think back to this impossible game I told you about, the one with all the black and red balls. Do you know who came up with it, actually? It was a guy called Daniel Ellsberg, and he was he worked for the Rand Corporation, and he was working for the military, of course, doing this kind of political consultancy, and he was a game theorist. And Daniel Ellsberg went from this position to actually leaking the Pentagon Papers. He is the basically first whistleblower in modern history. You know what the Pentagon Papers did by all sorts of deviations and chance operations. They managed to bring down the current the Nixon administration. And there was no way to predict that. From no way of game theory of game, could you have calculated the possibilities not only of that happening, but also Ellsberg at the end of the day getting away with it. So this is not what I'm asking you, I'm not trying to ask you to risk your freedom or your life or, jail sentence or something. No one asks you to do that. All I'm suggesting is that you bet on the side of generative fiction. And I'm not even asking you to, imitate something. You remember, this is an imitation game. You should not imitate a robot. You should not imitate a computer. You should not imitate a human. But maybe you just take a chance, with generative fiction. So how do you do that? When I ask you this question, you just start talking about the weather. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hito. As usual, brilliant and fun. Preguntes, qüestions que hi hagin a la sala, ja anirem passant el micro. Cap pregunta, cap qüestió? In the meanwhile, I would like to ask you a question. I mean, you've been also kind of sneaking into WikiLeaks and all this kind of stuff. How does it feel when you realize that the people that actually can have access to all that secret information behind NSA or whatever, they have to spend a lot of time interpreting that massive amount of data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because Laura Poitras, who is one of the people that has access to all these Snowden files, she was generous enough to allow me to look into very, selected parts of the archive, and you just look at it and you don't understand anything. Yeah. It's like many of these documents speak like a parallel language. And this is not only a parallel language, which basically has to be translated. There needs to be a glossary, terms. The meaning will only emerge once you put it into context. But this also mirrors a sort of parallel sphere of extra legality, where actually the law that governs, the management of these secrets is secret too. It's really fascinating. But, I very quickly realized I cannot deal with all these secrets. It's just, then basically the only thing I worked with was one single image, and it showed just TV noise, no? And on top of it, it said top secret. And I thought this was amazing. I wrote a huge text about just this image because I thought, wow, that's interesting. What does this mean? Yes, so yeah.
So behind the secret there is another secret and so on.
Yeah, but this says a lot of different things, that basically most of the images in general now, if you look at with your own eyes, it's even more abstract than TV noise. It's just data. There's not even the patterns emerging from like in crabstraction. Crabstraction is basically what happens when people start to analyze and interpret the data. Then you get basically some kind of representation of the data, right? But this looking or seeing has been more or less replaced by filtering, or trying to extract something from data or from noise.
Okay. ¿Preguntas? ¿Qué tenemos?
About boots as well, because I have a Twitter, and then in my account there are boots following me.
Of course.
And I know them, so it's like cool. But like 3 months ago with Microsoft, he tried to make a profile of Tammy, was the name. She only lived for a day because in 24 hours she became super fascist because the people were feeding with trolling or things like that. And I wonder if, I don't know, boots, what are they meaning between humans or the robot, the boot, or I don't know, maybe they can even create one day or do our work for us or whatever. About boots, it's my question. And how they become humans or fascists in 24 hours. I mean, Microsoft shut down the account because Tammy, I think the name was Tammy, became this in one day. So I felt super sorrow for her. And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm making a new work now about robots. And it's precisely about this kind of question, actually, who is working for who? It's very often not clear. I mean, I gave you a lot of examples where humans started to work for machines as assistants for machines, right? If you look at, this is something I cut, but Benjamin's chess Turk has been updated as Amazon's mechanical Turk, right? And this is basically this outsourcing agency where humans do jobs which machines cannot do well for fractions of cents, right? So in that sense, they also have become assistants to systems. But of course, it's not so simple. I mean, I think it's a sort of dynamic relationship, right? Machines do what humans tell them to do mostly, and this bot didn't become fascist of her own. She just mirrored, her environment, which was a sort of massive troll, fascist wave of, basically trolling. The poor bot was trolled. I mean, I really felt for her, I have to say.
Yeah, because it's like in science fiction when a robot becomes human or a replicant, it's when they fail or they feel something that it's wrong. And that happened with this bot. She was wrong because she became super fascist, or I mean, not polite. So that's a failure, what made kind of humans, the boot or the, I don't know, I always think
the interesting thing, if humans exhibit this kind of failures, what do? You cannot switch them off. Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah. There's one more question over there.
Hi, Hito. Well, I have this question which is related to robots. I always have this question in my mind. I don't know, I mean, there is all this talk about robot autonomy, intelligence, like artificial intelligence. And I've always had this question if through the robot we can escape the human perspective of the world. But I don't know if that's possible, because isn't the robot just a prolongation of it? I don't know if you think that, for example, artificial intelligence can escape that and create like a new form of intelligence, or it's just a prolongation of us. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
We'll see. I think it won't take very long for us to figure out, I mean, people got a sense of it when this artificial intelligence beat the world champion in Go, right? And then the Go champion was really, really shocked, because he said, okay, first the machine or the system learned from me, but then it started doing things which I've never seen before. So it recombined them in basically ways which the human couldn't predict. But I really don't know. And the thing is that we can speculate about this forever. I mean, especially as I have no idea of this, how this works. And I think it would be a waste of time for me. For me, it's more important to ask myself, what do I want from artificial intelligence? What do I want from automation? I mean, automation is happening. A lot of people have lost their jobs worldwide because of this. There always was this idea that, if automation becomes more popular, then people will just don't need to work anymore. They can have an income, basic income. None of that has happened. So the question is really, as humans, what do we want from technology, from automation, from artificial intelligence? How can it help us, create a better society? And we should discuss it and work for that. I think it's much more urgent, in fact, than if I try to speculate about, how robots will develop, because I really don't know.
Thank you.
Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, yo creo que ya podríamos dar por terminada esta conferencia. Gracias a todos por estar aquí, pero sobre todo, gracias a Hito. Thanks so much.